Let's just call it like it is. Loving someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style can feel like you're pouring your heart into a black hole. You try harder, you show up more, you shrink yourself, walk on eggshells, and second guess your worth, all while chasing a connection that never seems to land. If you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you're still in it, buckle up, because this might be the most important conversation you have with yourself. Today, I'm breaking down the 5 things I wish I knew after loving someone who couldn't or wouldn't meet me halfway. These aren't just tips, they're lifelines. Because healing from this kind of relationship isn't about blaming them. It's about finally choosing you. When you love someone deeply, it's easy to believe that love alone is enough to hold everything together. That if your feelings are strong, pure, and consistent, then somehow the relationship will work itself out, even when the other person is emotionally distant, avoidant, or completely shut down. But what I've learned the hard way is this: love, no matter how real, can't survive in an environment where emotional safety doesn't exist. Emotional safety is the foundation of any healthy relationship. It's that sense of being seen, heard, and valued for who you are without fear of judgment, rejection, or abandonment. It's the comfort in knowing that you can bring your full self, your joy, your pain, your doubts, your dreams to the table and not be met with silence, withdrawal, or dismissal. When you're with someone who is dismissive, avoidant, emotional safety is almost always the missing piece. And without it, even the most passionate love becomes a source of anxiety, self-doubt, and heartbreak. In the beginning, you may not notice it. Dismissive avoidance can be charming, independent, and even intensely affectionate during the early stages of a relationship. But over time, the pattern starts to show. The need for space, the discomfort with intimacy, the subtle pushing away whenever things get too close. You bring up something that bothers you and they shut down or change the subject. You ask for reassurance and they accuse you of being needy or dramatic. You express your feelings and they respond with cold logic, or worse, nothing at all. This kind of dynamic slowly teaches you to silence your own needs. You start questioning whether your expectations are too high, whether you're being too emotional or too sensitive. You begin to adapt, walking on eggshells, holding back your vulnerability, shrinking your emotional expression to avoid conflict or withdrawal. You think you're being patient or understanding, but what you're really doing is abandoning yourself to maintain connection with someone who can't or won't meet you emotionally. What I didn't understand at the time was that every time I minimized my own needs for the sake of keeping the peace, I was chipping away at my own sense of security. Emotional safety isn't about perfection. It's about consistency and trust. It's about knowing that when you reach out emotionally, someone is there on the other side to meet you. When that connection is missing, you live in a state of emotional limbo, where nothing ever feels solid and love becomes a guessing game. One of the most damaging aspects of being in a relationship without emotional safety is how it distorts your sense of self. You start internalizing the idea that you're hard to love or that your emotions are burdensome. You blame yourself for the distance, for the coldness, for the lack of connection. You think, if I could just be more laid back, less emotional, more independent, maybe then they'd stay close. But no matter how much you twist yourself into someone else, the emotional gap never closes, because it's not about you. It never was. Dismissive avoidants often struggle with intimacy because they've learned somewhere along the way that closeness is unsafe. Maybe they grew up in environments where vulnerability was punished or ignored. Maybe they associate emotional dependence with weakness or loss of control. Whatever the origin, they manage this fear by keeping people at arm's length, even the ones they claim to love. And while it's not your job to fix or change them, it's important to understand how their patterns impact your well-being. When there's no emotional safety, conflict becomes a minefield. You might try to talk about a concern or express how you feel, and instead of comfort or engagement, you get withdrawal or defensiveness. Instead of feeling heard, you feel invisible. The conversation either escalates into frustration or fades into avoidance, with nothing ever really resolved. And every time that happens, a little more trust erodes. Not just trust in them, but trust in yourself and in your ability to have your emotional needs met in a relationship. Love without emotional safety is exhausting. You're constantly hyper-aware of the other person's mood, trying to predict their reactions, tiptoeing around their triggers, managing their discomfort. Meanwhile, your own emotional reality is suppressed. You become the caretaker of their emotional boundaries, but no one's taking care of yours. And the worst part is, you may not even realize how deeply unsafe you feel until you're out of it, until you finally experience what it's like to be in a relationship where emotional availability is mutual. Looking back, I can see how often I mistook my tolerance for emotional neglect as strength. I told myself I was loyal, understanding, empathetic, and I was, but I was also scared. Scared of losing the person, scared of starting over, scared of what it would mean to admit that love alone wasn't enough. It felt like failure. But what I eventually realized is that staying in a relationship without emotional safety isn't loyalty, it's self-abandonment. True intimacy requires both people to show up emotionally, vulnerably, consistently. If only one person is doing the emotional labor, then it's not a partnership. It's a performance, and no amount of love, effort, or sacrifice can sustain a relationship that lacks the basic safety to be emotionally real with each other. So here's the truth I wish I had understood sooner. Love is not supposed to hurt like that. It's not supposed to leave you anxious, guessing, or starved for connection. Love that is healthy will feel safe. It will feel calm. It will allow you to be your full emotional self without punishment or silence. If you're not experiencing that, it's not because you're unlovable. It's because the relationship doesn't have the foundation it needs to thrive. And that's not your failure. That's just a sign to choose something better for yourself, for your peace, for your future. Emotional safety isn't a luxury. It's the bare minimum, and without it, love will always feel like survival. When someone you love constantly pulls away, shuts down, or keeps you at a distance, it's easy to start thinking it's your fault. You begin to internalize their avoidance as something you caused, something broken in you. If only you were more patient, more easygoing, less emotional, maybe then they'd open up. Maybe then they'd stay. This is one of the most painful lessons to learn after loving a dismissive avoidant. Their emotional unavailability is not about you. Their distance is not a reflection of your worth. It's a deeply confusing and often humiliating experience to love someone who can't or won't connect emotionally. One moment they're charming, engaging, even affectionate. The next they're cold, detached, or completely unreachable. You try to make sense of it. You analyze every interaction. You replay conversations in your head, searching for what you said or did that caused them to retreat. It's a mental spiral that feeds insecurity and self-doubt. You start measuring your value based on their level of engagement, which fluctuates without warning or explanation. What I wish I had known is that this cycle has everything to do with their internal wiring and very little to do with mine. Dismissive avoidants often grew up in environments where emotional needs weren't met, where vulnerability was dismissed or punished, or where independence was a survival strategy. As a result, they learned to rely on themselves, suppress emotional needs, and avoid deep intimacy. It's not a conscious choice to hurt you. It's a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. And while that context can create compassion, it doesn't excuse the impact it has on a partner who is left emotionally starving. The problem is, when you're on the receiving end of that distance, you don't see the fear behind it. You only feel the rejection. You interpret the silence as disapproval. You see the lack of affection as a sign that you're not enough. And slowly, without realizing it, you start trying to earn love from someone who's too afraid to give it fully. That pursuit becomes a trap. The more you chase closeness, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the harder you try. And in that dynamic, your sense of self-worth gets tied to someone who's emotionally unavailable by default. It's like trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing its shape. You're constantly adapting, being more understanding, less demanding, more accommodating, all in the hope that your love will eventually break through their walls. But here's the truth. You can't love someone into healing if they're not willing to face their own patterns. You can't make someone emotionally available by being more worthy, because their avoidance isn't a commentary on your value. It's a reflection of their fear, their wounds, and their choice to stay emotionally safe, even if it means pushing you away. What's most heartbreaking is how invisible you begin to feel in the process. You could be sitting right next to them and feel miles apart. You could be sharing your heart, your worries, your needs, and be met with indifference or silence. It creates a kind of emotional loneliness that is deeper than being alone. Because at least when you're alone, you're not begging someone for connection. When you're in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant, you're constantly waiting for a response, waiting for engagement, waiting to feel like you matter. Eventually, this kind of dynamic erodes your self-esteem. You start to believe that maybe this is all you're worth, that deep connection is something other people get to have, that you're asking for too much just by wanting closeness, comfort, or consistency. You shrink yourself to avoid pushing them away further. You censor your feelings. You hide your needs. And what you're left with is a relationship where you're emotionally present and they're emotionally absent. That gap becomes unbearable, but you convince yourself to stay because walking away feels like giving up. But here's what I wish someone had told me back then. Your worth is not up for debate. It's not something another person decides by how much attention they give you. You are not hard to love just because someone couldn't love you in the way you needed. You're not too much. You're not needy. You're human. And having emotional needs in a relationship isn't a flaw, it's a fact. Wanting to feel connected, seen, valued, and secure isn't asking for too much. It's asking for the bare minimum in a healthy relationship. Loving someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style teaches you a lot. But too often the lessons are painful ones about self-denial and emotional scarcity. You learn to settle for breadcrumbs. You learn to find meaning in mixed signals. You learn to survive on hope instead of clarity. And when the relationship finally ends, or when you find the courage to leave, you're left picking up the pieces of your self-worth, trying to remember who you were before you started believing you had to earn love. Healing begins when you stop taking their behavior personally. When you start seeing their distance not as a verdict on your value, but as a pattern they carry, one that existed before you and will likely continue after you. Their inability to connect is not proof that you're unworthy of connection. It's proof that they don't have the capacity, at least not right now, to show up emotionally in the way a true partnership requires. And it's okay to grieve that. To grieve the love you gave that wasn't returned the way you hoped. To grieve the version of the relationship you held on to in your mind. But don't grieve the loss of your worth, because that was never gone. It was just hidden behind the noise of someone else's avoidance. When you stop trying to earn love from someone who can't give it freely, you open the door to loving yourself again. You begin to relearn what it feels like to be safe with your own emotions, to feel at peace in your own skin, to trust your instincts when they tell you something's off. And eventually you realize that love isn't supposed to feel like confusion or anxiety. It's supposed to feel like home, and you deserve nothing less. There's something incredibly intoxicating about that electric-magnetic pull you feel when you meet someone and the chemistry is instant. Your heart races, your body responds before your mind can even catch up, and everything about them feels exciting, familiar, and urgent. It's the kind of connection that makes you feel alive, like this is it, like you found someone who gets you on a soul level. But here's what I've come to understand, that intense chemistry we so often chase is not always a sign of compatibility. In fact, it can be a trap, especially when it comes to loving someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style. When we feel deep attraction to someone who's emotionally unavailable, it's easy to mistake that spark for fate. You think the roller coaster of highs and lows means passion. You tell yourself that the emotional unpredictability is intensity, that it's evidence of something real. But what often goes unnoticed is how much of that spark is actually your nervous system reacting to uncertainty, not intimacy. The truth is, when you've grown up around emotional inconsistency, or if you've ever felt like love had to be earned, you can start to confuse instability with excitement and that kind of chemistry. It's not about connection, it's about survival. The deep pull we feel toward emotionally unavailable partners often isn't because they're the one, but because they activate old wounds. Something about the way they withhold affection, how they retreat when things get close, how they make you work for scraps of attention. It mirrors something familiar. Maybe it reminds you of a parent you were always trying to please, or a past relationship where you felt unseen. And instead of recognizing the pain, your brain frames it as attraction. It feels familiar, and therefore it feels right, even when it's not healthy. So what happens? You become hooked, not on the person necessarily, but on the potential. You fall in love with who they could be if they would just open up. You focus on the rare, fleeting moments of connection as proof that something real exists, while ignoring the long stretches of distance and discomfort. You invest more and more, trying to recreate that initial spark, believing that if the chemistry was there in the beginning, the rest will eventually fall into place. But it doesn't, because what you have isn't a solid foundation. It's a cycle of emotional starvation, followed by brief relief. And that cycle becomes addictive. Chemistry without compatibility is like building a house on sand. It looks beautiful at first, but there's no structure to hold it up. Compatibility means shared values, emotional availability, mutual respect, and the willingness to grow together. It's about feeling safe, not just excited. It's about having conversations where both people show up with presence and honesty, not where one person is constantly performing emotional gymnastics to keep the other engaged. Chemistry can start a fire, but only compatibility can keep it burning without burning you out. When you're with someone who is dismissive avoidant, you start to notice that the things you need most, emotional closeness, communication support, are treated like inconveniences. You might have chemistry, but when conflict arises or when you seek connection, they retreat or shut down. You're left carrying the emotional weight of the relationship, trying to decode their behavior and questioning your own instincts. And yet, because of that initial spark, you convince yourself that it's meant to be, that if you just hang in a little longer, they'll come around. But love isn't about holding out for potential. It's about showing up for what's real. And if what's real is hot and cold behavior, avoidance, and a lack of emotional reciprocity, then no amount of chemistry can compensate for the emptiness that follows. In fact, staying in relationships based on chemistry alone can actually make it harder to recognize healthy love when it does come along, because healthy love can feel boring if your baseline is chaos. One of the most liberating shifts in perspective is learning to differentiate between what feels exciting and what's actually good for you. Healthy relationships might not always give you that rush of adrenaline, but they give you something better. Peace. They make you feel grounded. You don't have to guess where you stand. You don't have to earn affection. You don't have to play games or constantly question your worth. There's a steady, growing sense of connection, not a wild chase. It's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you've been conditioned to associate love with struggle. Walking away from someone you have intense chemistry with feels like tearing yourself apart. But the pain of leaving is temporary. The pain of staying in something misaligned, where your emotional needs are never truly met, that pain lingers. And it chips away at your self-esteem in ways that are hard to repair. So if you're in a relationship where the chemistry is off the charts, but the emotional safety is missing, ask yourself, do I feel more anxious than secure? Do I spend more time hoping for change than actually enjoying the connection? Do I feel like I can be my full self in this relationship, or am I constantly editing my emotions to avoid pushing them away? These aren't small questions. They're the difference between chasing love and actually receiving it. Because here's the truth. Real compatibility doesn't leave you confused. It doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't make you feel like you have to fight for scraps of attention. Real compatibility is kind. It's calm. It allows you to breathe instead of holding your breath. And when you find it, you'll realize that the most powerful connection isn't the one that makes your heart race. It's the one that makes your heart rest. One of the most frustrating, heartbreaking realizations after loving someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style is this: you can't fix what they won't face. No matter how much you love them, no matter how hard you try, and no matter how deeply you understand them, you can't make someone confront the parts of themselves they are determined to avoid. And when their unresolved wounds, fears, or emotional barriers spill into the relationship, you may feel an overwhelming urge to help, to rescue, to heal, to prove that your love is enough to make them stay and soften. But the truth is, if they are not willing to face their own pain, no amount of effort on your part will change that. Dismissive avoidant individuals often operate from a deeply ingrained belief that vulnerability is dangerous. They've usually developed this attachment style as a form of self-protection, shaped by early experiences where emotions were either dismissed, punished, or simply not safe to express. As a result, they learn to rely solely on themselves, suppress their emotional needs, and avoid deep connections that might expose them to rejection or dependence. When you're in a relationship with someone like this, it can feel like you're constantly running into a brick wall. You open up, they shut down, you move closer, they pull away. And over time, this dynamic starts to feel personal, even though it's not. The natural response, especially if you're empathetic and emotionally attuned, is to try harder. You think, if I can just show them that it's safe to be close, they'll change. You may become the emotional caretaker in the relationship, constantly adjusting yourself to keep them comfortable. You tiptoe around conflict, minimize your needs, and shrink your vulnerability in hopes of not triggering their defensiveness. You start to believe it's your job to create enough safety for both of you to be the bridge that brings them out of emotional hiding. But here's the reality. You can't be the one to do that work for them. You can create a safe environment, yes, but unless they choose to step into that space, nothing changes. What makes this dynamic even more painful is that dismissive avoidants often don't acknowledge there's a problem. Because they've spent so long disconnecting from their own emotions, they can easily convince themselves that everything is fine, or worse, that you're the one with the problem for wanting more closeness. They might minimize your concerns, deflect blame, or respond to emotional conversations with cold rationality or silence. This leaves you not only hurt, but also confused. You start second-guessing your feelings. You wonder if maybe you are too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. But what's really happening is that they are avoiding their own emotional accountability, and in doing so, they're making you carry the burden. This constant emotional disconnect creates a relationship where you're doing all the emotional labor. You're the one initiating conversations, seeking clarity, and trying to maintain connection. And while you're busy trying to fix the relationship, they're busy avoiding the very thing that would bring you closer, facing themselves. Their fear of vulnerability becomes the cage that keeps the relationship stuck. And no matter how much love you pour in, it leaks out through the cracks they refuse to seal. It's important to understand that their avoidance is not about you. It's about what intimacy represents to them. Loss of control, exposure, the risk of being hurt. For someone with a dismissive avoidant pattern, closeness feels like a threat, not a gift. And unless they're willing to examine those internal beliefs and actively work to change them, you'll always find yourself reaching for someone who's pulling away. That emotional tug of war can drain your energy, your self-esteem, and your sense of reality. Sometimes, the most painful part of leaving a relationship with a dismissive avoidant partner is letting go of the fantasy, the belief that if you had just done one more thing right, they would have finally opened up. But that belief keeps you stuck in a cycle of self-blame. The truth is, it was never about you doing more. It was always about their unwillingness or inability to meet you halfway. You can't teach someone to be emotionally available if they're committed to staying closed. You can't build a connection with someone who sees vulnerability as weakness. And you can't keep bleeding yourself dry trying to fix wounds that aren't yours to heal. What makes this even more complex is that dismissive avoidants aren't always bad people. Many of them are kind, intelligent, and capable of love. They just don't know how to express it in a way that nurtures a secure bond. That's why it's so easy to hold on to hope. You see their potential. You catch glimpses of who they could be if only they'd let their guard down. But potential is not a promise. And staying for potential while ignoring the reality of your emotional deprivation only leads to more hurt. Healing from this kind of relationship means accepting that love alone can't change someone who's not willing to change themselves. It means grieving the loss of the relationship you wanted it to be and facing the hard truth that their inability to show up emotionally was never your fault. It means learning to stop seeing yourself as the fixer and start seeing yourself as someone who deserves to be met with effort, vulnerability, and care. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. You don't have to make excuses for their silence, their distance, or their shutdowns. What you do have to do is recognize when love turns into self-neglect and choose to walk away, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself. The person who refuses to face their emotional walls is choosing comfort over connection, control over intimacy, and that's a battle you can't win for them. You can love them with everything you have, but if they're not willing to look inward, to do the hard work, and to show up for the relationship, you will always be alone, even when you're together. And you deserve more than that. You deserve a love that doesn't have to be fixed, a love that's ready, open, and willing to grow with you. Walking away from someone you love, especially someone you've poured yourself into, tried to understand, and stayed loyal to through every emotional push and pull, is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But what makes it even more complicated when you've loved someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style is that the pain doesn't end when the relationship does. In fact, the real work begins after the breakup. It's in the quiet moments alone when your heart aches not just from missing them, but from trying to make sense of who you became while loving them. One of the hardest truths to accept is that healing doesn't come from waiting for closure from them. It comes from giving yourself the closure you never got. When you're in a relationship with someone who avoids emotional intimacy, you often leave with 1,000 unanswered questions. Why couldn't they show up? Did they ever care? Were you just not enough for them to change? And the silence after the end of the relationship only amplifies those questions. You may have left without a real conversation, without accountability, without even a proper goodbye. That lack of closure feels like a wound that never fully seals, because your brain wants a narrative. something to make the chaos make sense. But when someone has spent the entire relationship avoiding emotions, they're not suddenly going to become available just because you're hurting. You can't expect emotional maturity from someone who's been avoiding their feelings all along. This is where many people get stuck waiting for the apology that never comes, waiting for the moment they realize what they lost, waiting for them to finally say the words that could make it all make sense. But that waiting is dangerous. It puts your healing in their hands, and those are the very hands that let you fall. Dismissive avoidants often move on quickly, not because they're heartless, but because detachment is their comfort zone. Their ability to shut down emotions doesn't stop when the relationship ends. It's how they survive. That can feel incredibly painful for you, especially when you're still drowning in everything they seem to escape so easily. But that doesn't mean they didn't care. It just means they don't process things the way you do. So what do you do when the closure doesn't come from them? You create it for yourself. You face the truth that the relationship ended not because you weren't enough, but because the dynamic was unsustainable. You remind yourself that you were not asking for too much. You were asking for basic emotional connection, and that's not something they were willing or able to provide. You stop romanticizing the few moments of connection and start seeing the pattern for what it was: inconsistency, distance, and emotional neglect. And you begin to rebuild the version of yourself that forgot how worthy and lovable you are. A self-closure isn't just about saying, "I'm done." It's about grieving everything: the person, the potential, the parts of you that got lost trying to keep the relationship alive. It's crying when you need to, journaling when the feelings are too big to hold in, and letting go of the belief that if you had just done one more thing, it would have worked. You mourn the love you gave and you choose not to regret it, because loving deeply is never the problem. It's misplacing that love where it could not be received. Healing after this kind of relationship also means unlearning the stories you told yourself to justify staying. The belief that they just needed more time, that you were the one person who could break through, that their emotional distance meant you had to try harder, not that they had to meet you in the middle. You start to question the conditioning that made you think love had to be earned, and you begin the uncomfortable but necessary process of reparenting yourself, validating your own emotions, meeting your own needs, and showing up for yourself in the ways you hoped they would. There's no shortcut to this kind of healing. It's slow. It's messy. And there will be days when you still miss them, even after understanding they weren't good for you. That's normal. Love doesn't just disappear because the relationship ended. But with time, the ache softens. The clarity grows stronger than the nostalgia. And you realize that closure was never going to be a moment of explanation from them. It was going to be a decision made by you. A decision to stop reopening wounds in search of answers. A decision to forgive yourself for the things you didn't know back then. A decision to choose peace over pattern. Eventually, the silence that once felt unbearable becomes peaceful. You stop needing their validation to feel okay. You stop looking backward, hoping they'll become someone different. You start pouring into yourself the energy you once gave away so freely. And when you look back, you don't see a failure, you see growth. You see someone who tried with everything they had. Someone who learned the hard way that love should never feel like a battle you have to fight alone. The closure you're looking for isn't a conversation or an apology or a change of heart. It's the moment you decide to stop needing any of that to move forward. It's when you give yourself permission to heal even without their participation. It's when you take your power back, not in bitterness, but in truth. Because sometimes the most powerful closure is realizing you deserved more and deciding you'll never again settle for less than a love that chooses you fully, freely, and fearlessly. Here's what I've learned the hard way. Loving someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style will teach you everything you didn't know you needed to heal within yourself. It'll crack you open, expose your patterns, and force you to confront the parts of you that thought love meant chasing, fixing, or proving your worth. And while that kind of love can leave you feeling depleted, confused, and heartbroken, it can also be the very thing that wakes you up. Because when you finally stop trying to earn the love of someone emotionally unavailable, you start remembering your own value. You stop settling for breadcrumbs. You stop believing that love is supposed to be distant or hard or one-sided. This journey isn't about blaming them. It's about freeing yourself. It's about recognizing the difference between chemistry and compatibility, between temporary connection and lasting emotional safety. It's about learning that someone else's inability to love you the way you deserve has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their walls. Most of all, it's about reclaiming your energy, your voice, your heart. So if you're coming out of a relationship like this or still wrestling with the aftermath, Let this be your turning point. Let this be the moment you stop chasing the unavailable and start choosing the kind of love that holds space for you, not just when it's convenient, but every damn day. You are not too much. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. And now you get to ask better. You get to choose better. You get to be better for you.